Welcome to our panel on novel ways of protecting air, land, and water. I'm Fred Tutman from Patuxent Riverkeeper. And I think we're going to find through the course of this workshop that what we're calling novel may not be as novel as we might think, that there are increasing number of tools that people can use online in order to quantify and measure various impacts. I'd like to share that my first grown-up job many, many years ago was at a small advertising agency where I learned the lesson that you can tell a lot about a person by their zip code. Dow Jones knows this, Wall Street knows this, retailers know this, people who want to sell you stuff know all about that. That's why you get the junk mail in your mailbox that you actually get. But the whole idea of people being able to look up stuff about you and make decisions about you, your habits, based on what they can find online is a little troubling to me. Generally, it's something I'm obviously going to have to learn to live with. I went to a workshop years ago when people went around and introduced themselves, and a guy said, "I'm a data miner." And I thought, oh, wonder what that is. It sounds like gold mining, but in fact, people sit around and look at their computer and look for information that they can use to either make money or sell stuff. But you can also get information off your computer that you can use for advocacy purposes, that you can use to help change the fate of a neighborhood or a community. But at the time, I had no idea what that was. It was a strange idea for me. So online research has actually replaced library research for a lot of people, particularly in a pandemic. Online research about health impacts, circumstances, all of that stuff. So with us today are two professionals who actually use online research in their work. I don't know about you, but I'm a guy that really hates to have someone else read my own credentials. So I'm going to let the panelists actually introduce themselves because I actually find that painful to listen to when people are talking about me. So let's start with Morgan. If you'll introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do. Then you can introduce Jan, but then we'd like to come back to Morgan and you can actually show us online what it is that you do with online tools. What do you say?
That sounds good to me, Fred. Thank you. I said before, I'm ready, Freddie.
Okay.
So I'm Morgan Johnson. I'm the staff attorney at Waterkeepers Chesapeake. And really, environmental justice and these tools are my passion, and I feel like are really in my blood. My grandmother and my great aunt grew up in Alexandria, Louisiana, in Cancer Alley, really in the thick of it with a lot of industries. And the big one around them was creosote production. Creosote is a pesticide that's used to treat wood in telephone poles and on docks. And it's really, helpful for its purpose, but it can be a really nasty carcinogen. And growing up around that industry really impacted them and their community members. And then later on in their lives, they really started their fight for justice using tools like this one to bring it to EPA's attention and local folks' attention that, we've got a real problem here and it's affecting our health. And so they use this to try and prove that. So that's really important to me. And so I went to law school at the University of New Mexico, specifically to do this work. I have my environmental justice certificate. I did about 3 stints in my clinical program working on environmental justice issues in water context and air context. I was in the New Mexico Environmental Law Center as a clerk for a couple semesters working on environmental justice issues in the Southwest with lots of different clients. And so, I came back to the Chesapeake after being here for a little bit for an internship, and I'm the full-time staff attorney at Waterkeepers Chesapeake, where we're working with all of the waterkeepers in the region like yourself, doing really good work on the ground and work with a lot of different communities in the region. And so I'm supporting that work and using these tools to help, illustrate what's going on.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Jan, your turn. Tell us a little bit about you and how you fit into this picture.
Sure. Thanks, Fred, and thanks, Morgan. I'm really happy to be a part of this event and especially this panel. My name is Jan Michael Archer. I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. My main focus, within the School of Public Health, I'm in the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health And within that, the final kind of nest is the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Laboratory. And that's those three phrases: community engagement, environmental justice, and health, are really what I'm all about. I graduated from the University of Florida with my master's, 5 years ago now, maybe more. And I was, really bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to work for the federal government. And I have a degree in interdisciplinary ecology and wildlife science. And so I was really excited to go out and, diversify the green groups and diversify the environmental movement and stuff like that. And this was prior to really knowing anything about the real terms of environmental justice. But I almost immediately encountered, setback after setback, whether it was dealing with ageism as, an intern in some of these spaces, dealing with racism as a Black person. And I instantly knew that, okay, I need to get my weight up on this. I think I need to go back to school and learn a little bit more about kind of the systematic ways that I can approach and some of the tools that I can use to actually see these changes in our outdoor spaces. And so now I'm, just like Morgan and just like Fred, I'm using these tools to identify the environmental injustices in not just the world around me, in my neighborhood, my communities, but communities all across the country. I've had the privilege of talking with community members from Uniontown, Alabama, to North Charleston, South Carolina, to Wilmington, Delaware, and in each of those, kind of the unifying thread is overlapping burden and overlapping disparity. And it's one thing to hear directly. I mean, there are kind of two things that can make someone pay attention to these issues. One is hearing the real stories from the people's mouths, from the community members' mouths, seeing their anguish, seeing in some ways they're very real psychological and physical scars of this injustice. Another way is to see it on a map and actually visualize it from the comfort of your home, maybe, and see these complex interactions and these cumulative impacts. So I'm really happy to share some of these tools today and how I use them in my research.
Wonderful. So what do you say we do some show and tell? I think Morgan has something prepared for us to look at. I can't wait. So a moment of truth, when we see if the screen share actually works seamlessly like it did in the rehearsals.
Yes.
Because I only know a few shadow puppets and only know a few jokes I can tell as fillers. So here we go.
All
Excellent.
right.
All right.
So I am going to get this going. Let's enter into the full screen. So I think when we were planning this, we were thinking about some things that I could really contribute to the discussion, because Yan, he's the map guy, like he's behind making it, but there are people who are using it. And I think we really are beginning to think about how we're taking these from tools to rules, is what I'm calling it. When we had our summit for Waterkeepers Chesapeake, where we were thinking about, with some mapping experts, how these tools can be used. And in preparing for that, we talked to Dr. Wilson, Dr. Jacoby Wilson. And one of the things he was mentioning is how important it is that we think about how we are making these maps something that we can hold agencies and industry accountable to, and make it usable for community, but to give them some heft, to these tools. And so I guess I wanted to start out by saying that there are a lot of these tools out there. There are a ton of them. Fred, I think well from your time doing this work, how much more has popped up onto the scene. And that's for a few reasons. So digital maps and publishing and the internet really sped up the map making process. The development of GIS and increased accessibility to those tools really helped things boom. And so there's a lot out there. Also, the availability of data to work with is really increased, because air monitoring tools and some of the tools we use to do water monitoring have become more available, more accessible, and more affordable. And so who is able to come up with this data has also really changed. It's not just government agencies, it's nonprofits, it's community members as well who are using it. But the one that I kind of want to focus on here, just to shape our conversation, is really EJ Screen. Not because it's the end all to be all, and we'll talk about the positives and some of the negatives of working with it, but it is probably the most widely used tool in this space. It's one that most of the people who are listening to this panel know. So it's a really good one to focus on when we're thinking about bringing it into the legal context. So epaejscreen went public in 2015 during the Obama administration. epaejscreen uses 11 environmental indicators and 6 demographic indicators. Those include race and income, and it generates these color-coded maps. It can also generate standard reports for an area that's selected, and will compare data and risk at the state, EPA, region, and then the federal level. And so this tool is really used across federal and statewide decision making. EPA uses the tool internally to do their permitting, enforcement, compliance, and then for some of their voluntary programs as well. And so I think to help let's see. Oh, slide share. There we go. There we go. This is what I want. So to illustrate, one of the ways that I've used it in the past, when I was in law school, one of the things that I did was look at epaejscreen for the community that my grandma and my great aunt came from, because I wanted a better picture of what they were talking about and to help think about, what some of the regulatory gaps are that led to this. So these numbers aren't so current. I did this a few years ago for anyone interested in this particular place, but it gives a good indication of, what you might turn out from doing epaejscreen. And so these maps compare this one, the minority population, and then the NADA toxics cancer risks. And here on the right side is the report that was that you can use, in epaejscreen. And this standard report will use these 11 indicators that I was talking about, and will compare those numbers across the US, the region, and then the state. And so these are pretty, illustrative, pretty clear tools. But there are some, good things about them and some caveats for people working with them. And so I will talk about that a little bit. So on the left side here, I talked about some of the challenges that we need to address when we're working with epaejscreen, and then some of the pros where it's been really helpful. And balancing these is important when you're working with, this tool and others. So the first one is that this uses census level data. That can be really challenging because we know there are disparities in who has access and who feels comfortable with taking the census. And so that can lead to some really serious gaps that we can talk about, in the next couple slides. I'll give some real examples of how that can play out. This data, really needs to be updated continuously. There have been a lot of really great articles, particularly lately, who've been calling on the new administration to really make some updates to this, both in the data that it's using and in the accessibility of the tools. And one good thing to know is that the data can cut both ways when this is being used in the decision-making process. So for activists and advocates who, want this to tell the story of the community, depending on the lens of it and the scope and how you're using the tool, it might not, tell the story that you wanted to, or that might be helpful in that context. So there are some really important considerations when, scoping out how the data is used. And the other thing is, it's not like a final verdict or, the smoking gun on if a community is an environmental justice community or will face risks or impacts. And that's been a really important point in some legal cases that I'll talk about. And the good thing to know too is that when you generate that report, as with, most things out there, there is fine print. So epaejscreen also has fine print. EPA's acknowledged some of the limitations with it. And that, there's some uncertainty in the data, that it is a screening tool and not necessarily a detailed risk analysis. But I don't want to, hate on it too much because there are some really good aspects to it. It's readily available and it's free. Anybody in the US and in the world who can access the EPA's website can have access to these tools. And so it's really helpful for communities who might not have all of the resources, to come up with some of these tools on their own. It is there and available to them. And it's not just data journalism. This is a maintained data set. So one thing we've seen a lot of lately is that there will be, related to journalism and painting the picture about a situation, really awesome interactive tools that use data, but it might not be like a maintained database or data set. So it is important that this tool, fits in that category. It is a compelling visual tool, and industry knows this. When I was doing my research for this panel and thinking about, how epaejscreen is used, I found some really great articles that are put out by law firms who advise industry clients and work in permitting. And they know that epaejscreen can be really compelling when you bring it to decision makers who are looking at these things. And so they've really honed in on, hey, there's limitations to this, because they know it is compelling and community uses it a lot. It's also played a role in some rulings recently, which has been really interesting. Louisiana's 19th Judicial District had a ruling from, in a verbal, I guess, ruling. A judge really said, using some of the epaejscreen stuff that community plaintiffs had presented, that it was very compelling, and that the epaejscreen was an actual part to coming to her conclusion. And so, that is a pretty new sort of outcome with this. And it's also used for a variety of purposes. So even if I can't bring this into court and say, we got environmental justice issues here, here's the epaejscreen report, it might not just work out that way, but you can use it for a lot of different things. In administrative hearings, you can use them in amicus briefs when you're supporting, community, if you're doing briefing. You can put them in news articles to make the case for Title VI. Fred, I know with the Title VI case for Brandywine and your mediation that you were working on, the epaejscreen was an important part of your Title VI complaint. And it was on one I worked on back in Albuquerque. Another thing is for case development, just thinking about how we're going to, maybe help a community or work in enforcement, and then in other articles and forums. And so this is a really accessible tool in those contexts. So when thinking about, some of the limitations of it, one thing I guess I would like to turn our attention to is epaejscreen at the Fourth Circuit. This was a really high profile case. There's a lot of writing about the Union Hill community and dealing with Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and the Air Board. So in this case that I can use as an example of some of the limitations of plugging in the epaejscreen. So the Virginia Air Pollution Control Board uses epaejscreen to determine whether EJ communities are implicated in a proposed action. And so their epaejscreen analysis was to just kind of, plug community in, and geographically, I know there were some limitations as to how they did it. But when they ran the epaejscreen, they found that it was a less than 50% minority population. 50% is the threshold, and initially found that they weren't an EJ community for the purposes of the site suitability analysis that Virginia law requires them to do. And so community came back and had their data, and they used a door-to-door survey to demonstrate that they had an 80% minority population in this area, which was totally different than what the epaejscreen pulled out. That's important for the census reasons. We know that's kind of created some of the limitations there and some other limitations to that data. And it was really interesting to look at the briefs from a lot of our friends who are on the side of community and, doing this work, and community groups saying, hey, epaejscreen is limited. It's not enough to paint the picture. And so that's what I'm saying. It it cuts both ways. And so that's good for advocates to know, that you're making your case, either way with epaejscreen. But the issue that the court was really ruling on is that even though they did this environmental justice analysis and kind of checked off the box, found, okay, this is an EJ community, but they won't face those adverse health impacts, that was not enough for what Virginia's law required, that it required them to really look at the adverse health impact analysis, to look at asthma rates and other indicators, and that could have been a fuller analysis of it, which epaejscreen might not tell that very full picture. So this was really a big community win. It was a big blow to a lot of industries. But, some courts have deviated from this ruling already. And so it's important just to keep it in the back of our minds, but not the end all, the be all. So I want to talk a little bit about Brandywine. Fred, will you talk with me about Brandywine a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, obviously don't speak for the community,
Right.
but we have some familiarity with what they struggled with. Incidentally, I know the prior community, Buckingham, I grinned when you showed that picture because I've had my picture taken in front of that church as well. At the time, I think the church was in the pathway of a pipeline, right? This historically Black church really rose up and made a partnership with the nearby Yokaville, among others. And my good friend Chad O'Bach is in the back of that picture. But now, have you heard, having beaten the pipeline, now they're facing gold mining. There's a whole other thing that's coming their way. So I don't know if our adversaries use epaejscreen to find communities to beat up on, but I'm telling you, if it's not one thing, it's another.
Yep. Oh my goodness. It's true, Fred. That is, one of the things I looked at too was that, the Navy also had some permitting that they were seeking. And so that's another fight that came on the heels of this. And so it's like, the fight goes on and on, but that's how it is. That is really how it is. And I think it's important that we're doing the work to try and change that. But, they definitely, industry is aware, like they're aware. So I guess one thing I wanted to draw attention to is bringing a model for bringing epaejscreen directly into the regulatory framework. So as a result of Title VI complaint, so Maryland state agencies have an obligation under the federal Title VI law to avoid causing unequal impacts on the basis of race. And so the community of Brandywine and friends brought Title VI complaint forward and were able to, mediate. And one of the things that came out of that process was these PSC regulations from the Maryland Public Service Commission to make sure that applicants who are seeking permits include epaejscreen and a standard ACS epaejscreen report in their application. And so this is a really interesting model. This is from the research that I've done and asking around a little bit, one of probably the first instances of that happening in like a state regulatory level, to have epaejscreen, crystallize in that. And so that I think is a really interesting application of this, and innovative, and one where practitioners in the future might want to seek out something like this while still being mindful of all these caveats of using epaejscreen. And the next thing I want to touch on is what advocates should be asking for, because we got to move forward with applying some of these tools and making sure that they get better and addressing some of the shortcomings of them. One is funding and maintenance and making sure that the tools that we have stick around. ToxMap was one tool that I know a lot of advocates use to know what toxics and other risks are in their community. And that tool went offline in 2019 with very little said about it. It just kind of went offline, and that affected a lot of advocates who use that in their work. Consistent and equitable monitoring is really important. This little clip that I've got is from Albuquerque. This is an air monitoring station that's in the South Valley of Albuquerque. That is a very high minority community. Many people who only speak Spanish as their primary language and have done that for generations. And because of permissive zoning, that community has had a lot of industry built around these historic longstanding neighborhoods. And so, for that community, the air monitoring that they do there will monitor for, like, let's say 8, different toxins at this stationary station. At another station on the other side of town, where it is more white, it has a higher, medium household income. That station monitors for the full battery, the whole, all of the air toxics that they could monitor for. And so it's something to look at. You can use these as indicators, but it's good to know that they're not telling the full picture in some communities where they will others. And, that's something that advocates should look out for. The last thing I want to touch on is that a lot of people have brought up one of the challenges with epaejscreen is that we need to improve access to it and training on those tools. But maybe if training people is too hard to get it into community hands, we need to work on that tool and make sure that it is, in the way that it's presented, more accessible to lots of people. But a lot of these asks are being answered at the federal level. Next week, there is going to be a meeting hosted by EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. It's a multi-series on the Mapping Inequality Project and how to use these tools. I encourage anybody to sign up. If you email me, I will send the link to you so that you can join in that meeting. I'm really interested to hear in what they're going to be working on. There's some legislation in Congress that is working on funding and creating some more reliable tools for not just decision makers to use, but for communities themselves to use. And so that's exciting to have that potential for investment there. And then the latest thing, there's some executive actions that the Biden administration is taking specifically aimed at expanding these tools and their applicability. So there's some interesting stuff going on and lots of ways that we can plug, these tools into the legal and regulatory framework. But I think it's going to take a lot of work and attention and calls from all of the people who are on this call and watching the panel to make sure that we shape these tools up to make them as helpful for all of us as they can be.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank
it's
you.
probably worth noting that there's a game that often gets played with this, where it's a game changer to actually have objective sources of information about what those impacts are, because the applicants, the other side of this equation, generally wants as little discussion about the actual impacts as possible. Basically, those discussions happen after it's too late to do anything about those impacts. And so
True.
the battle to get into a record for an administrative hearing, right, or even in a court case, in a piece of litigation, full disclosure of those impacts is a really tough task, because I think the applicants and the permitters, the governmental, the regulatory authorities, I think they reluctantly understand that if you had a full disclosure of these impacts, you probably wouldn't want that project anywhere, not let alone at this particular spot. And so it is a game changer in terms of empowering communities to be able to point to an objective source of information about at least some of those, where some of those impacts might come from, at least what some of the nodes we should check on or consider when we're looking at the 360 degrees of a project.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, you wanna take us on a ride? Take us. Got your joystick ready, buddy?
Yeah, I would love to. Morgan, you provided an excellent introduction to what I am going to share, which is basically going to be a demonstration of just a few cases using these tools for the benefit of the audience. And so what I have pulled up right now is the EPA epaejscreen tool that Morgan introduced. Right now, we are looking at the EJ indexes layer for NATA cancer risk, which is National Air Toxics Assessment cancer risk. So you might recognize some of these places that are lighting up. Certainly, we see a big, huge clusters here in California. California has been actually, when we're talking about these tools and being on the leading edge of cumulative impact analysis and research. California has been definitely doing their due diligence, their DD. And so we can talk about, there are several state specific, we'll talk about in a second, we'll talk about the Maryland epaejscreen, which is a state specific tool for doing this type of analysis. But and I'm one of the kind of architects of that tool, but we definitely took a lot from the Cal EnviroScreen, which is another tool that deserves at least mention and definitely deserves a look in your spare time. But so when we're looking across the state, we can see these hotspots. So what do all these hotspots really mean? Well, with this layer on the cancer risks, basically these are areas where cancer risk is either in one of these different classes, the 95th to 100, 90 to 95th, and on, percentiles for the country. And so let's zoom in. This is Taking Nature Black, and we're talking about novel ways of protecting our air, land, and waterways. And so one of the first things that comes to mind is Flint, Michigan. So I can type in here, Flint, Michigan, and it pops right up. And this zooms in. So Flint, we're typically familiar with the water and lead issues in Flint, correct? But the benefit, as Morgan was saying, the sheer benefit of these tools is that you can actually identify multiple hazards, multiple exposures at the same time, relevant to the communities and the populations in those areas where those hazards exist. So right now we're looking at cancer risk as related to Flint, Michigan. I can turn on a tool here that's called the side-by-side mapper. It opens in a separate tab, and with it still zoomed in on Flint, I probably should open this ahead of time. With it still zoomed in on Flint, we can now look at side-by-side. Right now it's showing us proximity to traffic versus percent ratio, income, poverty level. So let's switch it up a little bit, and let's look at our lead indicator. So lead paint, environmental indicator, and update this map. So that's kind of the scope and extent, and again with limitations in the data that's available. But there's Flint, Michigan with regards to lead. And now let's look at, right now we have it as percent ratio of income to poverty level, but let's look at it in terms of population and race. So, and actually it's not giving me race. Why is it not giving me race? Usually it gives, well, I think I can actually do household income by race. Here we go. Black population below poverty level, update map. And so now what we can see between these areas is the intersection, right? And we can see the darker areas where the same places where we have Black populations below the poverty level, we're also seeing high impacts for that lead, right? And you can do it in the main tool in a way that I think is a little bit better. I can click on add maps, more demographics here, and I can do it as a graduated symbol map. So this, it's a little nuanced. You might not really get the whole picture looking at it this way in the sense of like comparing two things that are apples to apples. I like comparing apples to oranges though. So we're gonna use circles over this overlay of these actual census block groups. And so I'm going to change this now to percent Black alone and add that to the map. And again, maybe I should have added this before. But now what we're seeing here, and I'm going to zoom in, we're seeing the population of Black people relevant to these hotspots. Okay, so the darker colors are where it's higher impacts from cancer risk. I can switch this over and make sure that I'm looking at lead. Okay, and so we see in virtually all of the areas that have high impacts, there's also high African-American populations. And if we zoom out, we can kind of see that trend. I mean, if we zoom all the way out, we'll see that trend, and not just for Black populations, but people of color and low wealth and people in low wealth communities. We'll see that association, across the states where you have these areas of high percentages of Black people being heavily impacted by environmental hazards. And even so, this is great because epaejscreen gives you the opportunity to compare this to the country. You can also flip a switch and compare it to the state. So you can compare Black communities just within Michigan. But environmental justice operates on such an intimate and community level, you find yourself wanting to go even deeper. And so for that, we have devised and developed state level mapping tools like the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening Tool. So I'm going to flip over here, and this is something I did prepare ahead of time. I got the links up. So I'll drop all of these links into the, I'm not sure if Fred, if you'd already been doing this, but I'll drop these links here. Okay, so now we're looking at the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening map, which gives us a picture of the extent of environmental injustice throughout the state of Maryland. And right away, you can see the hotspots. We've scaled it in such a way so that the top 10% of communities, and this is by the census tract level, which is a little bit higher than a census block group, and I guess it's smaller than counties. Relevant to zip codes, it's kind of all over the place, so we won't bring up zip codes into it. But you can immediately see that, these darkest areas are in the top 10%. And so right now I'm going to zoom in Baltimore, which, as it happens, is another community very highly impacted by lead, and specifically the Black community in Baltimore is highly impacted by lead. And so what this is showing us, now I can click on any of these census tracts in Baltimore. I can get real deep, real close in here. And what this will show me, once I click on them, it will show me actual considerations compared to the county, compared to the rest of the county. So you can see overall, when we're looking at Baltimore, there's a lot of lead impacts across the whole, across the city. And it's somewhat reminiscent of Dr. Lawrence Brown's black butterfly concept. For those of you who are tuning in who aren't familiar with Maryland, if you look on a map of the population of the associations of poverty and Black communities in Baltimore, you get these two wings here, kind of in the northwest and southwest over here, and then also here on the northeast side and a little bit here going, and it kind of approximates like a butterfly shape. And you see that same relationship when we're looking at environmental justice overall, and when we're looking at individual factors affecting environmental justice. But right now, I just want to compare it to the county and then to the state. So you can see that this specific census tract is showing me in the 93rd percentile, which is higher than the county and almost double of the state. And so you can zoom around to all different parts of the county. And what are we throwing into this? What are we actually looking at? When we say environmental justice score, how did we calculate it? It's actually calculated based on some of the factors from EJ score, but also other factors that we deemed relevant coming from a school of health and a public health perspective. And so when we look at these different categories, we have the NATA data, the national air toxics, the air pollution data, traffic proximity, ozone. We also have proximity to different risky sites or hazardous sites like Superfund sites and like water dischargers. But we also have layers relevant to asthma and heart attack and low weight birth and low weight infancy. These are things that, again, we see the literature tells us, and the community, more importantly than the literature telling us these things, or maybe I won't put it in terms of values, at least equally important as the data is telling us and the publications are telling us, the community members are telling us, just like Morgan was giving us with the example in Union Hill. That these are issues that are stacked on top of issues, on top of issues, on top of issues, and at the bottom of it all are these community members. And so we've got the health layers in there, and then finally we have our demographic layers, including poverty, including race, ethnicity, education, linguistic isolation, age, and unemployment. And kind of another thing that really makes the Maryland tool stand out apart from the epaejscreen tool is its inclusion of specific context layers relevant to Marylanders. And a really great example of that is our relationship, our state's relationship with concentrated agricultural feeding operations, or CAFOs. What you are seeing here en masse on the Eastern Shore are chicken houses. Chicken houses upon chicken houses upon chicken houses upon chicken houses. And what that is doing, and this is actually a really good point to think about the data problem that these mappers have. They're beholden to the data that's available. And for the, I don't know if any of you who are on the call or any, I mean, I know some of, at least Fred, you're familiar with the odor, the smell, the chicken house, right? And so that's not a really great smell to be around, to live around. It affects you mentally, and it affects you physically, mentally, psychologically to live in these situations. And that's when we're talking about burden from health hazards, we also have to talk about the psychological and stress and emotional damage that our communities are facing.
Yes. I'm snapping to that. Yes.
I'll get off the soapbox. I'll get back to the map, to the data. So what we're looking at are these chicken houses. Now we have data layers in here relevant to air pollution, right? And those of us who were doing the work on the ground, we were very familiar with the air pollution hazard that chicken houses create. However, due to some very shady maneuvering in our state, but not limited to our state, a lot of these chicken houses are not held to the same standards of reporting this air pollution, right? So on our map, you actually don't see a whole lot of environmental injustice areas relevant to these chicken houses. And I can turn off my overall layer and I can just look at relevant to our air pollution layer. And it's like there's not even a blip. And so these failings and these gaps in the data availability definitely need to be known, because just like the Virginia DEQ, people are willing to use these tools, even if they just want to check a box. Some in goodwill do want to use these tools, but they really need to know the limitations and the barriers that these tools present. They're good in some ways. Another really common tool setback with a lot of these tools is they focus a lot on urban context, not so much on rural context. So these are kind of the things that we're trying to work through as we develop this technology moving forward. Fred, something you said reminded me. I actually just this morning pulled up the letter from the Birmingham jail, and I heard the words, more and more, I feel like the agents of ill will have used time better than those of goodwill, right? Have used their time. And it reminded me when you were talking about using these tools, using epaejscreen to find out, oh, what's a good neighborhood for me to put up a power plant, or to put up a train line through, or a pipeline through. And so that's another thing. Just like I mean, I don't want to beat up on my child that I've created, but I do have to be upfront with the limitations. And already we're seeing some of these tools being used by real estate, entities and people with interests that are not of and for and by the community to highlight these vulnerable and sensitive areas. And that's another thing that as we are creating these things and putting them out into the world, we have to think ahead to those potential negative impacts. How could this tool be used to gentrify a community? How could this tool be used to make an existing and already vulnerable community even more vulnerable? And so I don't want to end on that, because that's not a gift. And we were instructed to leave gifts, to bring gifts,
That's right.
to our participants and to our communities. And so the gift is like Morgan said, these tools, by and large, a lot of them are free. And there's a lot of information either from EPA, and anytime someone puts out a tool, they always put out a user guide. There's a lot of support, on YouTube and stuff like that. So I really encourage, just like you go online periodically and you Google yourself. You don't have to admit it. I Google myself probably more than I should, but go online and epaejscreen yourself, and see what's going on in your community. See what's going on in a community that's nearby you, but maybe not your community. And see how your neighbors might be living, because I think just going back to the letter from Birmingham jail, all of our fates are connected. And so I cannot be free in my community, and live to my highest potential until someone in Brandywine or someone in Curtis Bay or Cancer Alley or Flint, Michigan are free and living, to the best of their ability and to their true potential. And so I'll end on that.
I hear you. And what really comes into focus for me when I look at this stuff is a paradigm I've lived with and been depressed about for a long time, which is rather than having become a right and an entitlement, a clean environment has actually become a commodity. And as a result, most of us buy, acquire, inherit, however we get it, the very best and highest environmental quality we can afford. That race and class really do, not so much a zip code, but race and class, you know, actually do influence the kind of air you're likely to breathe, the likelihood that you'll have clean water, whether you'll have food that is, you know, nourishing and nutritious. These are dividing lines within the American system. That's what environmental justice really is. It follows class and race and wealth, and that's what these tools help us, I think, see much more objectively. I think they're very powerful for that reason. We really do see that we're not all talking about the same thing when we're talking about air, when we're talking about water. So what do you say we open this up to our audience? I know we've got a bunch of questions that are stacked. So why don't we dive right into it? See one right here. What are the water impacts, drinking water and clean water currently included in epaejscreen? I think you touched a little bit on this, Jan.
Sure.
Yeah.
So under, oh, and this is something that I didn't touch on, but so epaejscreen gives, so these chloropleth, these color mappings, one of the layers is proximity to waste dischargers or water dischargers. And through the Clean Water Act, I mean, Morgan, feel free to please check me on this, but through the Clean Water Act, dischargers are given what's called a NIPD's permit that allows them, you know, to basically, based on their operation, they've shown that they should be allowed to discharge liquids from their facilities. And those permits are given out to discharge into surface waters. And so that's some of the layers that you can look into, or that's one of the layers that you, if you're interested in water issues, look at that proximity to dischargers layer.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to share too, beyond epaejscreen, another great tool that we have access to is the ecosystem, which shows you compliance data, you know, from the NIPD's permitted facilities. And so you can see when they're in compliance and out of compliance. And that's another good source for information when you're just looking. One, if I could put in like an ask, you know, on my wish list to like, if it's a Biden administration doing this or like, you know, nonprofits doing more of these tools, I want more water tools. I think there are a lot of really good air tools. And so much of this work is cross-cutting. That is like, you know, when we're talking about overburdening, that is what we're talking about. It's not just the air, it's also the water. Like it's also other, you know, risk factors in your home and outside of your home. But it would be really nice to get some more of these like clean water tools and indicators. And as the Clean Water Act nears the 50th year of its existence, that's one thing maybe we can work on a little bit.
I know for a fact that there are water advocates that have used these tools in order to do strategic planning in terms of identifying where their outreach needs to be intensified, where the actual problems and burdens in their watershed or in their, you know, their sphere of influence are likely to be found. Patuxent Riverkeeper also collaborated with the University of Maryland a few years ago and actually mapped where public investment for the environment went in the state.
Yes.
That was an extraordinary trip that we've had difficulty getting people to really focus on. It really told a story about where people are likely to get a restoration project or get public money applied. Because remember, the whole public money scene to me is very different than private money. Public money is your and my dough, and where that gets allocated, where those tax monies get allocated. And there's certainly were some disparities that were revealed in Maryland surrounding that. So here's a question about on the ground canvassing. Is that the only solution to clarify the gap between census versus actual demographics for a community? Literally, I guess that means going door to door potentially, right? Mm-hmm. Is that how we fill those gaps potentially? Anyone have a feeling about that?
I got something, but I don't want to cut you off, Morgan.
No, I didn't. I was looking to you, yeah.
So the canvassing, I like the canvassing as an idea because I like getting out into the community and hearing these stories firsthand. But it's a lot of time, it's a lot of energy, in a lot of cases, it's a lot of money to rally those efforts. One way that, so I would never argue for totally replacing that, because at a certain level, if you're not doing that, you don't have the pulse of the community. But another way to get that and have the community members sound off on their own is to include in these tools a public participation interface. And so a way that, just like when you go and you EJ screen yourself, you could then leave a comment. So similar to something on Google Maps or Yelp, right? Imagine if there was a Yelp for environmental justice. I might just start going on Yelp and dropping environmental justice complaints. But that's one way to get community engagement, community informed information into these tools.
There are some deep questions here. I'm going to apologize in advance for kind of skipping around a little bit because I don't want to bog us down into a deep instructional session on how to use epaejscreen. But here's one that's potentially bogging. Is there any documentation yet for Maryland tool, the Maryland tool? The training for epaejscreen is helpful for orienting the new user, but I found the Maryland tool difficult to use, especially to get definitions of diagnostics. Is that a wonky, difficult question to answer succinctly?
No, it is not difficult.
Good.
So we have one manuscript published in an open access journal about the tool, and that kind of gets into how, the more of the background and the behind the scenes and kind of the development of the tool. We have 2 more publications also in open access journals in progress to kind of better elucidate and provide some of these case study examples and kind of walk through. We do have a user guide on the tool, but I mean, we're developed at the need for this is so strong that it's actually kind of outpaced our ability and in some cases our funding to continue development on the tool, but more information is forthcoming, and I really appreciate the interest.
How about other filters like biotic meshes, like tree cover? Have those been integrated or pulled in as well? I guess there would be others, not just tree cover. I can think of a few others.
Yeah, so we're actually working on, we have, alongside this tool, we also have a park equity mapper, which maps kind of the extent of access to park spaces and green spaces. And as kind of a jump off from that is our climate and health mapper, which is kind of way in the beta mode. But we have this climate and health mapper, which includes urban heat island effects, more of that green space stuff, coastal flooding, water impacts and stuff like that. So that's in the works and hopefully coming, launching soon.
That's cool.
Here's another. I'm sorry, go ahead, Morgan. Didn't mean to cut you
I
off.
was just going to say, I know there's other groups of advocates who are working too on trying to do like a green infrastructure index too. And so that'll be, another neat concept and product, but go ahead, Fred.
No, I just was going to kind of observe that we're kind of low on time now. And if you wanted to kind of tie off some thoughts here, I'm going to assume that people can reach out to you through the chat on Whova and can ask other questions. But I'd like to just save a little bit of time if you want to kind of sum up, basically. And I guess the best place, I suspect, to sum up would be, how can we use these tools more effectively? How can we win more recognition for them as useful tools? How can we take this to the next step? Not just something on a computer, but something we can use on the ground. Anybody want to take a whack at that? Yeah,
so I think in terms of using the tools more effectively, I almost kind of want to flip the question in terms of how can we make sure that when people, just like the question that you passed on, when people are using the tool, how can we open up these communication channels better so that when people are getting bogged down, they don't really know, how it's working and stuff like that. How can we make sure that there's easy communication to keep improving the tools? Because a lot of these tools, I'll be frank, I don't think they're in their final form. I think in terms of the ground truthing needs, in terms of the data needs, I think there's a long way to go. And the only way we'll get there is through that communication and interaction with the users. And so one thing that we're trying to build into our tool is that public participation aspect. And once we get that more, I think we'll be able to create better tools that are more useful to community members.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Morgan, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I like to, this is a little Pollyanna-ish, I try never to be, but sometimes when you do this sort of work, you're like, we need a little good feeling something. But I think one thing that is really good is to make sure we continuously make space to talk about these things. And not just within like, oh, I'm, an environmental advocate. We just need to talk about, you know, how to use and have access to these tools where we can, with our greater community, because it's like knowledge is power for sure. And it's good to have knowledge about what's going on around you. So I think accessibility needs to be kind of at the top of what we're talking about when we're rolling out more tools. And I guess I think the last thing is to be aware of the caveats with when we want to pull these into regulation. That's really important, because it can do what we want. It can also be challenging for us too. So keep that in the back of our minds when we're working on integrating these tools.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Whirlwind tour. So long for now.